too that the recordings will live on the registration website here. I'll put the link in the chat. So the recordings for today, you'll see the recordings for the previous two sessions there, and the recording for the session will be put there after, probably later today. All right, Steve, take it away.
All right, thank you, Chris. So today I am going to be talking about a self-paced course that I developed. Let me start sharing that. I'm assuming everyone can see that. As I go along, feel free to just jump in and ask questions. I'd be happy to take those, or you can hold them to the end, whatever you prefer. My name is Steve Sturman. I am an instructional designer at the UB School of Social Work. And 2 years ago, we launched a new doctorate in social work program. And with that program, we decided we want to integrate virtual reality into that program to both use it as a teaching tool and also to have our students understand how virtual reality could be used in the field of social work and related health professions. So over the past couple of years, I've been trying to figure out what VR is, how you could use it, and why it would make sense for social workers. So as part of this, I developed this course. The course is really meant for our instructors to get a sense of how they can use virtual reality and also to just figure out what virtual reality is. For this particular mini course, I built upon my experiences here at UB, but it was really designed for a course that I was taking at the University at Albany, the systematic design of instruction. So this course kind of grew out of that course and the professional work I'm doing. As you'll see, it's a self-paced course. I developed it in Google Sites because Google Sites is a pretty simple web-based platform for developing websites. And because this was primarily for this course I was taking at the University at Albany, I didn't want to use school resources or things like that at that point. So Google Sites made sense at that point in time. So let me tell you a little bit about the course. The first thing I started with was a needs assessment to try to figure out exactly what our faculty needed to know to be successful in using virtual reality in their class. And, we started with the basics. They needed to know what VR, AR, and XR are. Most of our faculty are pretty technology savvy. This is an online DSW program, so most of them are familiar with using technology for teaching, the course LMS systems, things like that. But VR is not something they really knew a lot about. So I really had to work on just giving them the basic knowledge of what VR is and how it could be used. We also need to teach them the skills to use VR. So for this particular course, we, in our DSW program, we use the Oculus Quest platform. All our students are required to buy it. Our faculty all have headsets, and that's what we use for the VR component. So faculty also needed to not only understand what VR is, but they also had to become comfortable with using their headsets, navigating around in there, and also figuring out what types of apps are available for them to teach with and what type of learning exercises they could actually use with VR. So these are some of the things that we identified that our faculty needed to know. So we started with this needs assessment, and we took what we found and we converted those to performance-based objectives. That way, when we design the course materials, design the activities, we'd have a way to understand whether faculty actually got what they needed out of the course. So once they're finished with the course, we wanted them to be able to identify the differences between AR, VR, and XR. We wanted them to have the skills to use their Oculus Quest systems, feel comfortable using them. We also wanted them to be able to support the students because they were going to have issues and things with the Quest because this is a new technology for them too. So we wanted them to understand what they would need to do to help support their students. We wanted them to understand how VR can be used for learning activities so that they could thoughtfully integrate the VR into their course instead of just trying to do it as like an add-on or just a fancy bells and whistles type of thing. Our faculty also needed a good understanding of how VR was currently being used in social work and other health-related professions so that they could really show their students and understand for themselves how VR is actually being used in the real world. And then we also wanted them to be able to develop their own activities. And then a very key component is, since VR is so new and it's constantly changing, we wanted them to start thinking about how they were going to keep up with changes in VR and how it's developing and evolving. So we wanted them to think about those things also. So once we identified all our objectives, I set out to start developing the actual course materials, identifying things that they would need to know, activities that would support learning these objectives. And in doing that, I integrated Fink's taxonomy of significant learning as the structural framework for the course. For those of you that might not be familiar with this, Fink's taxonomy is based around these 6 different areas. And by integrating these different types of areas, you can get your students to be more engaged in the learning process so that they'll get more out of it. So you want to look at foundational knowledge, application. So how would they take what they're learning and apply it to real world needs? Integration. So how do we take this information and integrate it into the things that you want to accomplish? The other dimensions of your life. There's the human dimension. So thinking about how this personally affects you or affects others and integrating that into the materials and the design. And then caring and learning how to learn are also part of the taxonomy. So when I developed the course, I integrated this within the types of materials that I decided to use, and also the types of activities we had our instructors to do. So just to give you a sense of this, here's a couple. So for instance, for application, we wanted the instructors to develop their own learning plan so that they could effectively learn how to use the technology. We wanted them to acquire the skills and apply the skills of how to actually navigate in their headsets, how to use the controllers, those types of things. And we also wanted them to identify applications they might be able to use within their courses. And then thinking of the human dimension, because this is a new technology and sometimes people can be nervous about learning something new, especially with regards to technology. We wanted them to think about their prior experiences with learning new technologies and think about why were they successful with learning something or not successful. Integrating that dimension into the course so that they can really think about their own processes. We also want them to think about things like accessibility and how they would make their assignments accessible for all students, because VR is so highly visual and you need certain motor skills to be able to use the technology. We wanted to make sure that they were thinking about alternative assignments in case they had students which might be precluded from using the head-mounted displays and the controllers and things like that. And we also just wanted them to understand how VR can be used to support a better understanding of other people, how it could be used to develop empathy for certain populations. So that's just a sense of how think taxonomy is integrated throughout the course materials. When I began the course, I initially planned out 4 units, and I'll go into this in a little more detail in a minute. But as you'll see, after I submitted this for my course at Albany, I then went back and I decided this unit 3 needed to be split out into 2 separate units. So the course is now currently 5 units. And let me just briefly go through some of these units. So for instance, in unit 1, we start with an introduction to why we are using VR in the DSW program. And this is really to tie into the taxonomy of caring and the human dimension, so that we're building the motivation with the faculty to understand why this is something they should care about and why it should be important to them. Once we have that motivational piece out of the way, we then go into the basic foundational knowledge they need to know. What is VR? What is XR? I'm going to hear all these different terms. I need to understand what it is that they're actually explaining. So we get into a little bit of that. And then we go into specific social work and health-related profession examples of how VR is currently being used in the real world. And this, again, ties into that foundational knowledge so that they have that basic understanding about how the technology is being used. It also gives them some application. They can start thinking about how they might use it within their course, or how they might introduce this to students as being something that's important for them to learn for their professional development. And then we also try to build upon that human dimension and the caring dimension by selecting specific populations that our instructors are interested in, work with, and support, so that they can see how learning about VR and how it's being used would tie to their professional research, their professional practice. So this is unit 1. Once they've gone through these materials, there's just a quick little quiz that helps them understand how well they understood the content, just so that they can do that on their own. In unit 2, we then get into skills development. So in this unit, this is where they're actually taking their head-mounted devices and learning how to use it. So we start with a reflection piece. You know, we want them to think about, okay, in the past I had to learn this new technology. So maybe they're thinking about, okay, I've got a new mobile phone. How do I figure out how this works? And we want them to think about, you know, the resources they used for that. You know, did I have a friend that helped me? Did I go to a website, read a book? The time it took them to actually learn to become comfortable with that new technology. Think about any emotional barriers they might have faced, you know, and really start thinking about that and thinking about how that might play or how they might experience that in learning this new VR technology. And then we ask them to develop their learning plan. So, you know, thinking about how much time they're going to have to schedule to actually learn how to use the VR headsets and all that technology, the types of resources they might need, you know, the people they need to connect to, either me or someone in their household or a friend that might be able to help them out if they have hit a roadblock or need additional support. So that way they can thoughtfully prepare on how to use VR. Then I provide them with a lot of information on the basics. You know, this is how you set up your headset. This is where you should go to find the tutorials, go through the tutorials to figure out the basic controls of VR, and just get comfortable with using the interface, navigating and moving around in virtual reality. Once they've developed those foundational skills, We then asked them to start looking at the apps that are available within the Oculus library. And I make recommendations on specific apps that are somewhat related to social work to kind of point them in the right direction. So there's a bunch of apps that you can use for self-care, like meditation apps, exercise apps, things like that. So we recommend they try out some of those. And then we also recommend they try out Spatial. Spatial is an online virtual reality meeting place. So this is a great way for them to see how they might meet in VR in an environment other than Zoom. So it really allows them to think about how would they present in that environment. What's the benefit of using this over Zoom? What is Zoom better for, that type of thing. So it allows them to just build more experience with using the VR. And then after they've done all this, we ask them to reflect. Reflection's a really important part of the learning process. So we ask them, think about what you learned. Are there gaps that you still have in your knowledge? Are you comfortable? Do you need to go do more practice with the headset, that type of thing, so that they understand where they are in the learning process in terms of actually knowing how to use the technology, get into the content they need to. After they've done this, this provides the foundation for them to then move on and start thinking about how they would actually use this to teach and in education. And so the next unit focuses upon the learning theories that VR supports in terms of educational applications. So they learn about situated learning and how you can use VR to take students into virtual environments that mimic real world environments. We talk about experiential learning. So they can actually go through and experience an environment as if they were in the real world environment, interact with things, do some practice in the VR environment. And then we also talk about social learning. And again, this ties back into figuring out how to use that spatial classroom. You know, how are you going to get your students into a room together to have them discuss, interact, create things together? So we talk about all those ways that VR can be used and build upon the learning theories so that they are grounding their exercises, their assignments, their learning activities in actual learning theories, so that we can try to structure these so that they'll have a good impact on the learning outcomes. And then as they're doing this, we go back to the materials they covered in Unit 1 to talk about the specific learning examples that they saw there, how they might build upon those for their classes. And we also have them start thinking about their specific classes and where VR might fit based upon the types of activities that are supported in VR, the types of uses they've seen in Unit 1 and some of the other materials, and then start thinking about how they might develop their own learning activities. And that's when we come to Unit 4, where they actually sit down and start planning out that learning activity. So this is where they reflect upon the content, the experience they've already have. I provide them with a worksheet that walks them through the important steps of identifying what they want to do. And I'll show you that in a second. But we also ask them to think about the different supports that they will need, the students will need. And then again, thinking about that accessibility piece, because we think that's really critical. We want them to be thinking about that from the beginning instead of trying to go back later on and plan for alternative assignments in a haphazard way. And then the last unit is really an important piece too. As I said, VR is really new. It's constantly evolving. Every couple of years, there seems to be a significant development or a new piece of equipment that comes out. So we want them to start thinking about where they're going to go to stay abreast in changes, figure out what new uses it's been put to, that type of thing. So I point out some resources for them to get them started to think about that. And then we have them reflect upon their own learning plan. How are they going to stay current on the technology, the different ways it's been being used in social work, and where they're going to go to find information on those things. So this is the website. If you want to view it, let me copy this into chat. Oh, it's not cooperating. All right, let me do this. Let's stop share for a second. Let me open here. There's the website. Feel free to share this if you have faculty that might be interested in learning more about this. So here is the actual website. Like I said, it's developed in Google Sites. So Google Sites is a nice, easy tool to generate content and get it out there. So this is where they start with an overview of the course, figuring out what it is they're going to be learning, and then links to each of the different modules. As they go into the modules, they'll get their learning objectives for this specific unit, so they know what they're going to learn here. Then they can go through the different materials. So I integrate a bunch of videos that are out there on YouTube that will help them learn the content that I want them to at that point in time. So this is where they start with why and how we're using it for social work. And then we get into that piece about the different types of VR and the different technologies that they might use. And then these are the specific examples that are being used in social work right now. So just to give them a sense of what can be done with VR. And then this is the little quiz that they can take. And then this is the unit that talks about skills development. So again, just the learning objectives and the overview. And then this is the reflection piece. So, you know, having them think about what's it going to take to learn the technology, how much time, what type of resources, did you have to block out time, or did you just do it in an unstructured way? Things like that. And then with VR, there's some other things that they need to consider, like motion sickness. They have to plan around that because that's a common side effect. And then I provide them with some tips to overcome that. Also some idea of time that I would recommend that they block out to use the VR and get comfortable with it. You know, so an hour to get through the setup and go through the tutorials, and then 5 to 6 more hours just exploring on their own, just to give them a sense of what they need to do. And then this is information on how to actually set up their headsets, how to get into the tutorials. And then these are just some of the apps that I recommend: Notes on Blindness, Traveling While Black, and then some VR chat, Spatial, and Engage are some additional apps that they could find interesting and relevant to teaching. And then again, the ending reflection piece, you know, were you successful? What else do you need to do? What else do you want to learn? And then here is the information on the educational applications of VR. And and we have them start by thinking about how they might use it. Here's a sample assignment. So I created, this is the worksheet I give to them, and this is a sample assignment I put into the worksheet just to give them a sense of what we're looking for here. So we ask them to pick a topic, then identify their learning objectives, how they will assess whether the students met those objectives, and then talk about, so what is your actual VR learning activity, and start thinking about the student support. What do they need to know before getting into that activity? So do they need to know certain foundational knowledge? Do they need to have specific VR skills, things like that, so that the students can be successful once they do get into the VR? And then what other supports do they need? So let's see. And then, for learning about the educational applications, it's pretty much just linking to some articles and other resources. There's a couple good articles out there on how VR is being used in social work. And then social learning, just talking about some of the different apps they could use as virtual classrooms, things like that. And then this is the main part of it where they actually create their own VR assignments. So learning to use VR. And so this is just the basic worksheet I give them. And then just some more instruction on how to define their learning objectives, assessing learning outcomes, just some basic guidelines and things for them to think about. And then the continued learning piece is just having them reflect again. What type of information would they still like to learn? How are they going to find that information? How are they going to keep current? And then these are just some of the resources I recommend for them. And then, of course, at the very end, whenever you do a training, it's always good to get an evaluation and feedback from the people who take it, just so that you can make sure that the stuff you've done is meeting their needs, and identify any areas that may need improvement and things like that. So I just have a basic survey here that they can fill out so that I can use that for future improvement. So that's the course. Any questions? Let me pull this up.
So if you have any questions for Steve, yeah, you could just pull yourself up here and ask right here or in chat or however you want to do it.
Yeah, here's my contact information in case anyone has questions or wants to share the site out. Feel free to do that too. Yeah, somebody had a question. Sorry.
Yeah, Steve, it's Donna.
Hi, Donna.
I was wondering if you have you actually already run this course? Are you in the process of running it right now?
Well, it's really set up to be a self-paced course, so anyone can jump in at any time and use it. I just finished it up, so I'm in the process of making it available. Where we are in our DSW cycle, our first set of students just hit their first elective year. So for them, a lot of them are taking a course on how to teach because it's a doctorate level program. So I'm making this available to them so that they can use that to think about how they might want to use VR in their teaching. And the plan is to just put this out into the social work realm and hopefully people will just pick up on it and use it and find it useful.
How many people completed it in your first round?
I I really don't track that. Like I said, it's self-paced and it's just out there on the internet. So people can hop into it and use it whenever they want. I've run it past a few faculty and they found it helpful and useful in their thinking. To this point, most of the support I've been doing has been individual with the faculty within our program. I think we've had 6 classes over the past 3 semesters. So we do two courses a semester. So I've been kind of working with all of them individually. So this is kind of building off of that experience, figuring out what they needed to know, and then just developing this course to make it more structured. So as we move forward, we're talking about offering 2 cohorts at some point. So the number of faculty I'm supporting is going to grow quite a bit. So this is my attempt to get ahead of that so that there's less of my time going into the basics with them and more helping them with that unit 4 piece where they're actually thinking about the assignments, constructing the assignments, that type of thing, so that I can really help at that level instead of just helping them learn the basics.
Thanks, Steve.
Mhm.
See John's question there. John, if you want to ask it, I see you have your video.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, Steve, thanks for the presentation. I guess I'm wondering about unit 3, maybe that's the place. So suppose, you know, I'm a philosophy instructor, a poetry instructor, or someone who doesn't necessarily see the obvious application to VR. And so how might we help people decide whether it's appropriate? I mean, I guess you can see what other folks are doing out there, but given that it's new, there may not be lots of folks. So how do we help folks make that decision about whether it's even worth exploring?
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that goes back into the unit 1 piece where you kind of show them what's happening with VR in the field right now. With this specific course, was really focused on social work, but I'd be interested in expanding this to other disciplines. So if there are people out there that are working with VR or thinking about it and are in something other than social work, I think a lot of this is applicable and structured to be beneficial for those fields. It just, I'm lacking the curriculum specific knowledge of how it's being used. But I think developing that is a key component just to give people examples of how the real world applications and showing them, you know, this is, I'm sorry, what field were you in?
I'm thinking humanities, for example, you know, poetry, philosophy, something like that, where it's not obviously visual in a way, or it's not obvious where the application would be. How do we help people think through those less than obvious fields?
Yeah, so yeah, that's the challenging part that I think faculty are struggling with, because it's not always apparent how it might be used. I don't know if you have access to a Oculus headset or not, but I think that Notes on Blindness app would be really interesting in a humanities or poetry, because in that app, they actually are reading from a text and from a person who lost their sight. So as you are experiencing that in VR, the world kind of, as the reading stuff, different things are, you hear things and see shadows of things. So it's really cool in terms of how the VR adds that visual dimension to what this writer wrote about. So that would be a really interesting example, I think, to show people. So it's really identifying those good examples and getting those in front of faculty so that they understand the possibilities, or can even just start thinking about what those possibilities might be.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Steve?
Hey, Steve, it's Kevin.
Hi, Kevin.
So I'm just curious, with the faculty who have gone through your course, or any of them, are they teaching in VR yet? And if so, do they require students get goggles or the headsets, or are they just using something like spatial?
Yeah, so for our program, students must purchase the Oculus Quest headset. They know that as they're applying. We standardized on the Quest because it's a low cost system. It's like $300. So we figure it's similar to the cost of a textbook. And we try to integrate that throughout the course of the program. So we try to get the faculty to use it at least once or twice each semester with their students. Right now, the primary courses that are using VR for us are we have a trauma-informed course that's in their first semester, and that's where most of our application is right now. We have them do some assignments because it's trauma-informed. They're thinking a lot about self-care. So we have them use their Oculus Quest to identify an app that might be useful for self-care. So some of them, like I said, do the meditation stuff. Some of them do like virtual karaoke because they like to go out and perform. So they'll get into some of the social spaces and do that. There's the meditation exercise. Some of them just like gaming in it. So that's one way we integrate it. We've also created our own virtual reality learning environment. So we have this immersive virtual reality mental health agency, and the students can walk through that agency and see how trauma-informed principles are integrated into the physical space. So things like, is it accessible? Is it welcoming? Is it safe? That type of thing, so that they can actually see what a trauma-informed environment might look like and think about with their own agencies how they might change that physical environment to make it more trauma-informed. So yeah, we are using VR throughout the program. As part of their capstone, the students also have to think about how they might use VR within their own practice or agency settings.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So Carrie has a comment in the chat that it was interesting to see how you designed and structured the course. I really like that you used Fink's taxonomy to do it. I mean, I think that, practicing what we preach, right? Creating professional development programs that, follow the kind of pedagogical best practices we want faculty to make. It makes a lot of sense. I liked Fink's too, because, a lot of us are familiar with like Bloom's, and
Right.
Bloom's tends to have a kind of very linear kind of thing where you're going, bottom up, right? And I like how you kind of didn't follow a linear kind of thing where you had to go first through foundational knowledge all the way up, right? I thought that was a really, really interesting application of what you did.
Yeah, and I think Finks works really well with social work just because they have the human dimension, the caring, and they see that and they're like, oh, yeah. and I'm hoping that just the way the course is structured, it might also get them to start modeling their own courses in that way. So
the question I had too is like, I mean, you did this for, your graduate program, right? But, how much time? I mean, it took you a lot of time probably to put this together. I mean, if you did another one, I mean, you think it would take you less time now? I noticed a lot of videos you use, videos you just pulled off the web, like rather than having to create videos yourself, which I think is actually a really good idea. Frankly, I think everyone always thinks, oh, I have to make the videos myself for the course, but there's plenty of good stuff out there. Why do that, right?
Right, yeah, that's my philosophy. You've got people that have already done really good stuff. Let me use that, and then I'll focus on the pieces between to make those links, make those connections, and make it relevant to exactly what I want them to be thinking about. In terms of time, I did this over the course of maybe 2 months, maybe 10 hours a week. So it wasn't terrible. I had a lot of foundational knowledge myself because I've been doing this. If this was something that was totally new for me, I definitely have to spend more time researching and doing that, but I don't think it would be too difficult to do something like this again.
The other thing I liked about it is at the end, having that sort of linking them to communities of practice. I mean, I think, one of the things I always think about is when do you do something that's sort of self-paced and kind of like this, and when do you kind of bring faculty together in groups, right?
Right.
And my assumption is, and I'm curious if you share this assumption or what your thoughts are on it, that the self-paced stuff works especially well when you're learning sort of skills and like learning how to use a piece of technology, where there is kind of everyone needs to kind of go at their own pace, right? There's nothing more frustrating than being in a training or something like that for an LMS, and you've got some faculty in there who want to dive deep, and then you have others who are like, where do I have to click to see what means for my class, right? So the self-paced thing makes a lot of sense for something like this. Whereas something that's a little bit more, along the lines of what John asked before about applications, and then, where it'd be helpful to have discussions and helpful comments from people like Diane about, how you might, apply this in your teaching. That's when you kind of start bringing them together into groups and maybe go beyond just the self-paced thing. Is that kind of your thoughts as well?
Yeah. Because, especially with the nuts and bolts stuff, the learning the technology, it's really time on task for that. And if you're trying to do that through a workshop or keeping everyone on pace, it's really difficult because everyone is at different levels. Some pick it up and just run with it. Others need a little more support. So if you're able to do that and get that out of the way first by having them work at their own pace, it's much easier to then move to that second level of support where they really need the individualized attention and the help with the specific integration into their area of specialty. I think it would be impossible to just support everyone at that basic level through a workshop or through a time training.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. I mean, that was really cool just to see your process, and I really appreciated the background information. And I think anybody can pick this up now and probably do something similar. So it was really cool. Sort of open it up now. I mean, other questions for Steve, other things in your mind, what's going on? Anybody will have anything that they'd like to bring out with the group while we have everybody here for a few more minutes? Ria.
Yeah, I'm curious, how are people, the faculty that they work with, how are they doing in terms of energy and participation, and how do we support being exhausted and knowing they're exhausted? How do we support them? What are people doing?
Great question, Ria. That came up at our meeting 2 weeks ago. So I'd be curious if folks have thoughts about that. How are you keeping morale up?
I don't know. I can answer a little bit for Buffalo State. I mean, I don't know the morale question, but we're trying to provide opportunities, recognizing that our attendance is low and things. So opportunities both in person and virtual, and just for those who want to be involved, they have an opportunity. And for those who are overwhelmed and can't be, we get it. And so even more variety than usual, even more sort of formats and timings, which is harder on us in some ways. But folks are coming out in different times and in different ways. And so, I mean, that's at least how we're approaching it. We're here for you. That's the message we're trying to send. But we get it if you can't make it, and no hard feelings. We'll see you in the future.
What's the kinds of topics that you're addressing?
We have a book club, so I don't want to dominate, but we have a Friday morning book club. So we're talking about inclusive and equity kinds of issues, bringing that into the classroom. So that's one of the topics. I have a Decoding the Discipline series. So it's trying to think about disciplinary knowledge and how we're teaching that, how to boil the things down. I have a series on high impact practices. And then we're also doing our online series to get folks Oscar certified and all of that. So, I mean, we have a sort of a variety of, and then there's also the point and click stuff. So it's really just as they say, we have the catalog, and then we're here for you. We've also, some of our team have gone to booking so that folks are doing individual one-on-one things and fewer workshops, but they're still meeting with folks. So it's really just, we're here for you in as many ways as we can be. Of course, that makes us tired, but anyway, that's, I don't know if that answers your question, Maria, but.
Dave, did you want to share something?
Yeah, we actually here at Geneseo recently had a program trying to address that exact thing. We called it, taking the temperature of faculty and staff. How are you doing? It was actually really striking, the responses that we got to that program, who was in attendance, what the discussion was. Simply, some people in there saying, why is it taking so long for somebody to ask how it is that we're doing? So the approach that we're trying to take is we want to continue to have those types of sessions just to support our faculty and staff. We certainly don't have any answers to the morale problem, but we're hoping that getting people together to create networks of support for each other is helpful.
Ray, your question actually relates to something that has been on my mind lately, and actually it's a response to something John had asked us about over the summer, and that is meetings like this are great for sharing topics, strategies, just things that you're doing in your centers, but it would be good if we could have a sort of central location where folks could go when we're not in meetings like this to just sort of get a snapshot of what resources like Steve provided today are available on campuses to share with others, what kind of hot topics your centers are addressing, each semester, and then kind of, any events that may be open to other campuses to attend, especially now that a lot of things are still on Zoom. It's easy enough to bring guests in. And so, I've struggled even before I started the CPD. I was part of groups trying to figure out how to make that information easily available, but also easily collected, right? I think that's always a challenge. We could always survey and ask you all, but you're busy, right? And so, so I don't know, does anybody have thoughts? We could certainly send out survey every semester and try to collect that information, or we could put out like we do now, editable spreadsheet, a Google sheet that anybody can sort of fill information in. But, I'm sensitive to the fact that, asking you to do that when you have a lot of other things on your plate is kind of a tricky proposition. So yeah, anybody have any ideas about what would best work about sort of collecting that information and then distributing it out to everybody? I'm all ears.
Yeah, I'm wondering if a central place to just upload what goes on, here's an event that is, on Zoom, and here's the link, and here's what it's about, so that it's available. On my campus, everything that we do is not on Zoom, it's on Teams, and it's single sign-on, because that's how our campus runs it. But knowing what other people are doing, how they're doing things, and just chatting with other faculty developers is really helpful to me. Because I'm still learning this, and I'm a center of 2 with other supports, you know what I mean? So like all of us have very different centers and what people can do, but just hearing, oh, that's how you approached it. Maybe I could torque it this way and that would work, kind of thing. So a follow-up and more specific question of mine, if nobody else has anything, is we read Radical Hope by Kevin Gannon, and then he came and spoke at our Fall Teaching Institute, and that had 50 people, which I thought was, for this semester, enormous. I personally found it an incredibly inspiring book, and I'm wondering if other folks are reading it and using it. Cool, somebody else did, yep.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the chat to the book in case anybody's interested.
Thank you. He was a dynamic speaker. The second time I've seen him. Really wonderful to work with. So I recommend that really highly.
We did the same thing here at Geneseo. We did a reading of Radical Hope, and we had Kevin Gannon come give a talk virtually, and that was really well received. It's a great book. It's not that long. There's some great kind of takeaways from it, and Kevin's just a great speaker and a great collaborator.
Yeah, that was a real pleasure.
The series, that book series from West Virginia, there's a lot of great books. I believe Jessamyn's book, Geeky Pedagogy, was published as part of that series as well. So check it out.
Yeah, I haven't read that one yet. I have it on my bookshelf though.
Any other questions, thoughts? Just general, want the wisdom of the group.
Anybody going to pod?
I'll be there.
Nobody else, really?
Yeah, I mean, actually, now's a good time to go to pod because it's a lot cheaper than normal.
What is pod?
Pardon?
What is pod?
Oh, okay. Here, I'll put it up on the Hair Network. So
An
pod,
amazing resource.
Pod Network. I'm on their board of directors, their core committee. So I sound like I'm chilling now, but yeah, the Pod Network, I put the link in the chat, is sort of, it's like the network for people who do faculty educational development, professional development throughout North America and also across the world. You know, there are a few thousand members. The annual meeting, when it's typically in person, has, you know, yeah, like over 1,000 people attend traditionally. And you know, it's a pretty great resource, especially if you're new to faculty professional development. You know, there's, in addition to the annual meeting, there's a biannual Institute for New Educational Developers. They use that educational developer term because it's a little more inclusive than just faculty development. So it's pretty much for anybody that does professional development on a campus, works with faculty, works with staff. And there are resources on the website. There's a very active Google group. It used to be a listserv, and now it's a Google group list, whatever, that, you know, you can actually join it even if you're not a member. And so there's information on the website there if you want to join that. If you have a question, you'll usually get multiple responses from folks who are, you know, who've been doing this for years, if not decades. Membership is pretty cheap. I mean, it's individual membership. It's not like a campus membership thing, and membership's it's $105 for individuals to attend. And that, if you attend the conference, you pretty much get that back because the discount for it, members, I think, is like $120 or something like that if you're a member. So the conference, I believe, is only a couple $100 now online, and it's the second week in November.
Yeah, they have other resources and mini workshops, 2 meeting kind of pre-conference workshops and post-conference workshops, and meeting other faculty and educational developers across the country is extraordinary. I was privileged to be part of an early, like last year, Pod Connects, and there's 4 of us, now 5 of us that meet twice a month. We've been doing it for over a year. Oh my goodness. Having a variety of folks to pick their brains and know them well is just incredible. So
yeah, it's a welcoming group too. And you know, I've always wanted to have like a kind of a mini pod network kind of within SUNY, and that's sort of what the faculty development community of practice is supposed to be. But there's no substitute for that large network of people from, you know, across the country and, you know, again, across the globe, frankly. So
right.
yeah, definitely
Right,
check out at least the Google group.
yeah, with so many resources, you never feel like it's all on you. There's just always somebody who can come up with something. If you, it's really, when it's that big, it's pretty marvelous.
It looks awesome. Thank you.
Certainly. All right, anything else before we let you go? Just a reminder, so I did confirm, I mentioned earlier, for those of you who maybe jumped on a little bit late, there is a webinar coming up next week on the 28th. I'll put the registration link in there about desire to learn Brightspace. Now that we are out of the quiet period or whatever, the no comment period, and we know it's public, we're going to start hearing about timelines and all that, for campuses that are really interested in an aggressive timeline. You could actually do it next fall. And I know some campuses are interested in that because they don't want to have to pay for 2 LMSs. So, there'll be a lot of information shared there at that webinar next week. It will be recorded, and there will be additional sessions because that one, we actually had to get a larger Zoom room to accommodate all the initial folks signing up for it. So there's the link there. The link for today, for the recording today, is the website posted earlier. I'll post it again. It'll be here later in the day. I want to thank Steve again for a really cool presentation. So thanks so much, Steve. That was really cool. And our next one is in 2 weeks again, and that'll be Jamie Murphy from Delhi will present in 2 weeks. And again, we have 2 more after that. So good to see everybody. Stop recording and let you all go.